There is a hospital in the hills of eastern Kentucky that has not treated a single patient since the autumn of 1968. The windows are gone. The roof has caved in over the east wing. Trees grow up through what used to be the children's recreation yard, their roots cracking the concrete from beneath, slow and patient, the way everything in these mountains is patient. Local records call it Greenbrier State Hospital. The people who live nearby call it something else. They call it the place where 300 patients went in, and 300 patients, according to the only complete count anyone has ever managed to put together, never came back out. Not home, not to another facility, not anywhere that left a paper trail. This is the story of how that happened, told as completely as the records, the survivors' families, and 6 decades of silence will allow. Greenbrier State Hospital was built in 1931 on a stretch of cleared land on Cedar Ridge, about 11 miles outside the nearest town of any real size. It was constructed during a period when state governments across Appalachia were racing to build large institutional facilities for what the era's medical language called the feeble-minded, insane, and incurable. A single sprawling brick complex meant to house, in one place, the mountain region's poor, its mentally ill, its tuberculosis patients, its orphaned and disabled children, and anyone else a county judge decided didn't fit anywhere else. It opened with capacity for 412 residents. By 1940, records show it was housing closer to 600, in a building designed for far fewer, with a staff that peaked at its absolute highest documented point at 31 people, doctors, nurses, and orderlies combined, for the entire population of the institution. The hospital sat on 320 acres, most of it wooded ridgeland that the state had acquired cheaply because nobody else wanted to farm it. There was a main administrative building with a clock tower that, according to at least 4 separate written accounts collected by local historians in the 1970s, had stopped working sometime in the 1950s and was simply never fixed. Frozen at 417 for the remainder of the institution's operation. There were 4 residential wards, A, B, C, and D, connected by covered walkways, a separate building for the tuberculosis patients set apart from the others due to contagion concerns, a small chapel, a laundry building, and what the official state inventory from 1955 lists simply as Building 7, a low structure set back from the others near the tree line, whose listed purpose was storage and maintenance. The people admitted to Greenbrier in its 37 years of operation were, almost without exception, people the surrounding counties had decided they could not or would not care for themselves. Court records from the period, incomplete but partially preserved in the regional archive, show commitment orders for conditions ranging from epilepsy to postpartum depression to simple old age and senility, alongside genuine, severe mental illness. Children were admitted for what the records list as incorrigibility, a catch-all term that, reading the surviving case files now, appears to have covered everything from genuine developmental disabilities to children who were simply orphaned, unwanted, or in the way. One 1947 commitment order, preserved because it was contested decades later by a surviving relative, committed a 14-year-old boy for excessive willfulness after he ran away from a foster placement 3 times. He would spend the next 19 years of his life at Greenbrier. This was, in other words, not unusual for the era. Institutions like Greenbrier existed across the entire Appalachian region and much of rural America during this period, and most of them have faded into a similar kind of half-remembered local infamy. Old buildings, bad stories. Nobody quite able to say exactly what happened inside because the people who knew are dead, and the records were never kept the way they should have been. What makes Greenbrier different? What has kept its name alive in this particular corner of Kentucky for almost 60 years now is the number 300. The number of residents who, according to the most complete reconstruction available, were inside Greenbrier State Hospital when it effectively ceased operations in 1968, and the number of those 300 who were never accounted for in any subsequent placement, discharge, or death record that anyone has been able to locate. To understand how 300 human beings could simply vanish from the official record, you have to understand what record-keeping looked like at a facility like Greenbrier, and what oversight, or the near-total absence of it, looked like for institutions of this kind during this era. Greenbrier was chronically, severely understaffed for its entire operational history. The 31 staff members at its documented peak were responsible for a population that, by the early 1950s, had swelled past 700 residents, according to one surviving internal memo, nearly double the building's designed capacity. A single overnight shift, according to a 1958 staffing log that survives in the regional archive, was sometimes covered by as few as 4 orderlies for the entire complex, 4 people responsible for the nighttime supervision of hundreds of patients across 5 separate buildings. Record-keeping under these conditions was, by every surviving account, catastrophic. Patient intake forms were inconsistent. Some residents were recorded only by first name or by a ward and bed number, with no last name at all, a practice that seems almost impossible to believe today. But that shows up repeatedly in the partial admission ledgers that survived the building's eventual closure. Discharge records were kept even less consistently than intake records, because discharges, especially in the institution's later years, became increasingly rare. Once admitted to Greenbrier, the overwhelming majority of residents simply stayed, for years, for decades, until they died. At which point, a death was supposed to be recorded, a family notified if one could be located, and a body either released for burial or, increasingly, as the decades went on. And as more and more residents had no family willing or able to claim them, buried on the hospital's own grounds, in a section of the property that the 1955 state inventory refers to, without elaboration, as the field. This is the detail that, more than any other, has defined Greenbrier's reputation in the decades since its closure. The field, roughly 4 acres of cleared land on the northern edge of the property, beyond Building 7, beyond the tree line that separates the hospital complex from the surrounding forest, contains, by every ground-penetrating survey conducted since the property's abandonment, somewhere between 400 and 600 individual burial sites. Almost none of them are marked with names. The vast majority are marked, if they are marked at all, with small numbered metal stakes, many of which have rusted past legibility, corresponding, theoretically, to a burial ledger that was supposed to cross-reference each numbered grave with a patient's identity. That ledger has never been found. It is possible it was destroyed. It is possible it was simply lost, the way so much of Greenbrier's paperwork was lost in the chaotic final years of the institution's operation and the decades of abandonment that followed. Either way, the result is the same. Somewhere between 400 and 600 people are buried on that ridge, and the overwhelming majority of them have no name attached to their grave that anyone living today can identify. Greenbrier State Hospital did not close because of a single scandal, a single investigation, or a single dramatic event, in the way that the story is sometimes told in the more sensationalized retellings that have circulated online in recent years. Its closure was slower and, in its own way, more troubling than that, the result of a decade-long, mostly bureaucratic shift in how the state approached institutional care, combined with funding cuts, combined with a building that was, by the mid-1960s, simply falling apart faster than anyone was willing to pay to maintain. State inspection reports from 1963 through 1967, the most complete documentary record we have from Greenbrier's final years, preserved because state inspections, unlike the hospital's own internal records, were filed with a central state agency rather than kept on site, paint an increasingly stark picture. The 1963 report cites overcrowding, inadequate heating in 2 of the 4 residential wards, and a patient-to-staff ratio the inspector describes, in a rare moment of direct language for this kind of bureaucratic document, as dangerous. The 1965 report cites structural concerns in Ward C significant enough that the inspector recommended immediate evacuation of that wing, a recommendation that was not followed, according to subsequent reports, for at least 18 months. The 1967 report, the last full inspection conducted before the facility's closure, is the most damning of the 3. It documents, among other findings, a tuberculosis outbreak in the separate isolation building that the report indicates had gone unreported to state health authorities for an estimated period of several months. A discrepancy between the hospital's claimed population of 481 residents and a physical headcount conducted by the inspector that came up 43 residents short. And a notation, brief, unexplained, never elaborated upon in any surviving follow-up document, that reads simply, Burial Records Office, so-called, could not produce ledger upon request. Informed will be located and forwarded. Not yet received as of filing. That ledger was never received. The 1967 report was the last inspection Greenbrier ever underwent. In early 1968, the state legislature passed a budget that defunded the facility entirely, citing the cost of the structural repairs identified in prior inspections as economically unjustifiable relative to the state's broader institutional consolidation plans, which called for remaining patients to be transferred to 2 larger, more centralized facilities elsewhere in the state. The transfer process began in March of 1968 and was, according to every account that survives from people who were involved in it, chaotic, rushed, and incomplete. The state's plan called for Greenbrier's entire remaining population, officially listed, at the time the closure order was issued, as 431 residents, though, as we've already seen, the hospital's own population counts had been unreliable for years, to be transferred over a period of approximately 4 months to 2 receiving facilities, one approximately 90 miles to the east, one approximately 140 miles to the west. The transfer was carried out using a small fleet of state vehicles and contracted buses, moving residents in groups, generally without their full medical or personal records, which were supposed to follow under separate cover, but which, according to staff at both receiving facilities interviewed decades later by local researchers, frequently did not arrive, or arrived months late, or arrived with names that didn't match the residents who showed up. This is the part of Greenbrier's story where the documentary trail becomes genuinely, verifiably incomplete, not through any single dramatic act of destruction or cover-up, but through the accumulated failure of an already broken system trying to wind itself down. The receiving facility to the east logged the arrival of 206 residents from Greenbrier between March and June of 1968. The receiving facility to the west logged the arrival of 181. That's 387 residents accounted for in transfer, leaving against the hospital's last official population count of 431, a discrepancy of 44 people. And that's before accounting for the fact that the 1967 inspection had already found the hospital's claimed population to be 43 higher than an actual physical head count, suggesting that the official population figure used to calculate the transfer numbers may itself have been inflated by a number suspiciously close to the gap in the transfer accounting. Local researchers and several journalists who have investigated Greenbrier's history over the decades since have proposed various explanations for this gap, none of which can be definitively proven given the surviving records, and all of which are likely true to varying degrees for different individuals within that missing count. Some residents, almost certainly, died at Greenbrier in the chaotic final months before transfer and were buried in the field, without the death being properly logged in any record that survived. Some residents may have been informally released to family members during the closure process, a practice that, while not officially sanctioned, would have been consistent with the general administrative chaos of the period, and that would leave no paper trail if the family never formally notified the state. And this is the explanation that has fueled the most speculation, precisely because it is the hardest to prove or disprove. Some unknown number of residents may simply never have been transferred at all. Left behind in a building the state was actively in the process of abandoning, for reasons that range from administrative error to something far more troubling that no surviving document directly confirms. What is verifiable, because it comes from multiple independent sources rather than speculation, is this. When a maintenance crew was sent to Greenbrier in late September of 1968 to begin the process of formally decommissioning the property, boarding windows, securing the buildings, doing the basic work required before a property is handed over to the state's Surplus Land Division, the crew foreman, a man named Harlan Beck, whose account was recorded in a 1979 local newspaper retrospective and corroborated by two of the men who worked alongside him, reported finding Ward D, the smallest and most isolated of the 4 residential wards, still occupied. Ward D had been built, according to the original 1931 architectural plans, as an overflow ward, a smaller secondary residential building intended to handle population surges beyond the capacity of wards A, B, and C. By the 1950s, internal hospital correspondence suggests it had been repurposed, somewhat informally, as a ward for what the era's clinical language termed chronic, non-improving patients, residents whose conditions, in the medical understanding of the time, were not expected to change, and who therefore received the least attention, the least staffing, and, by every surviving account, the least documentation of any population at the hospital. Harlan Beck's 1979 account, corroborated by his 2 former co-workers in the same retrospective piece, describes arriving at Ward D in late September of 1968, roughly 6 months after the official transfer process had begun, and supposedly weeks after it should have been completed, and finding the building still occupied. Beck's account, quoted directly in the 1979 piece, describes the scene. Residents still in their beds, still being given meals by what remained of a skeleton staff that had apparently simply continued operating the ward because no one had formally told them to stop. in a building that the rest of the institution had already begun to abandon around them. Beck estimated in his account that there were around 30, maybe more residents still in Ward D at the time of his crew's arrival, a building that, according to every official transfer log, every state correspondence record, and every closure document that survives, should have been empty months earlier. What happened to those residents after Beck's discovery is, frustratingly, one of the better documented parts of this story, if only because it generated enough of a minor bureaucratic scandal at the time to produce a paper trail. State officials, notified of the discovery, arranged for an emergency transfer of Ward D's remaining residents over the following 2 weeks, and this transfer, unlike the earlier ones, appears to have been logged with somewhat more care, likely because someone, somewhere in the state bureaucracy, recognized that "we forgot about an entire ward of patients for 6 months" was the kind of finding that could generate real consequences if it wasn't handled carefully. 34 residents are recorded as being transferred from Ward D between October 1st and October 14th, 1968, to the same Eastern Receiving Facility that had taken the bulk of the earlier transfers. 34 residents transferred, logged, accounted for. And yet, this is the detail that Beck's account includes, almost as an aside, that has nonetheless become one of the most repeated and most disturbing elements of Greenbrier's local legend in the decades since Beck's recollection. Given 11 years after the fact, but corroborated independently by both of his co-workers in the same 1979 piece, is that when his crew first entered Ward D, before any of the residents had been moved, he counted the beds. 41 beds, occupied. Not 30, not 34, 41, never 7 residents, by Beck's count, present in Ward D at the moment of discovery, who do not appear anywhere in the subsequent transfer logs. It would be irresponsible to present Harlan Beck's count of 41 beds as definitive proof of anything specific. Beck was recalling a moment from more than a decade earlier when he gave his account. Memory is imperfect, especially for a non-clinical observer doing a quick visual count in an unfamiliar, likely distressing environment. It's entirely possible some of those 41 beds were unoccupied, or occupied by bedding and personal effects rather than people, or that Beck's count was simply wrong. The 2 co-workers who corroborated his account in 1979 corroborated the general scene, the discovery of an occupied ward that should have been empty, but neither of them independently confirmed the specific number 41. They deferred to Beck's recollection on the exact count. But the number has persisted, in local telling, for a reason that goes beyond simple morbid fascination with a discrepancy in an old bureaucratic record. It persists because of what happened, or what local accounts say happened, in the years immediately following Greenbrier's final closure, when the property sat empty, unsecured beyond a few boarded windows, slowly being absorbed back into the surrounding forest, the way abandoned rural buildings in this region tend to be. Local accounts, and it's important to be direct about the evidentiary status of what follows, which is oral history and local legend rather than documented fact in the way the preceding sections of this story have been, describe a pattern beginning within the first few years of the hospital's abandonment and continuing, by some accounts, into the present day, of people who have entered Ward D reporting the sense of being watched, of hearing what's variously described as murmuring, shuffling, or in a detail that recurs across multiple independent tellings collected by local researchers over the decades, which is itself notable, given that these accounts were gathered from people who, in several documented cases, had no contact with each other and no apparent access to each other's stories, counting. The sound several accounts describe of someone counting, slowly, quietly, in a voice too soft to make out individual numbers, somewhere in the building, with no visible source. Whatever the truth of those accounts, and a measured, skeptical reading would note that abandoned institutional buildings reliably generate this kind of story, regardless of their specific history. Simply by virtue of being abandoned institutional buildings, places the human mind is primed by decades of cultural association to find unsettling. The documented fact underneath the legend remains unresolved. Harlan Beck counted 41 beds. The state's records show 34 people transferred. No subsequent record, no death certificate, no burial record in the partial ledgers that have survived for the field. No later admission to another facility under a name that could plausibly be matched has ever accounted for the remaining 7. Greenbrier sat abandoned, essentially unmonitored, for the better part of 3 decades after its 1968 closure. The state's Surplus Land Division technically held title to the property throughout this period, but Surplus Land Division records show no significant maintenance expenditure on the site after 1971, and by the early 1980s, the property had effectively become what rural Appalachia calls, without much ceremony, just an old place, known to locals, occasionally explored by teenagers, daring each other to spend a night inside, periodically the subject of a local newspaper retrospective piece whenever a milestone anniversary of the closure came around, but otherwise simply left to decay. This long period of institutional neglect is, in its own way, as significant to Greenbrier's story as anything that happened during its operational years, because it's during this period that whatever remained of the hospital's physical records, the partial admission ledgers, the staff correspondence, anything that hadn't already been lost or destroyed during the chaotic closure process, was subjected to 3 decades of an unsecured, leaking, rodent-infested building with no climate control and no oversight. A partial records recovery effort conducted by a regional university archive program in 1994, the most significant attempt anyone has made to formally catalog what remained of Greenbrier's documentation, recovered what the project's final report describes as approximately 40% of estimated total original documentation in varying states of degradation, with significant gaps, particularly in burial records, ward-level patient logs for wards C and D specifically, and any documentation from the final 18 months of operation. That 1994 recovery effort is, to date, the closest anything has come to a formal, academically rigorous accounting of what happened at Greenbrier, and even that effort, conducted by trained archivists with institutional backing, explicitly concludes in its final report that a complete reconstruction of patient population, transfer, and mortality data for Greenbrier State Hospital is not possible given the surviving documentary record, and any total figures for patients unaccounted for following the facility's 1968 closure should be understood as estimates derived from incomplete cross-referencing rather than definitive counts. In plainer language, nobody, not local legend tellers, not journalists, not trained archivists with grant funding and years to spend on the project, has ever been able to say with certainty exactly how many people went into Greenbrier State Hospital over its 37 years of operation and never came back out, by any means, into any record anyone can find. The number 300, the number that gives this story its title, the number that's repeated in nearly every local retelling, comes from the 1994 University Report's own best estimate, calculated by cross-referencing the hospital's various inconsistent population counts against the partial transfer records. The partial burial ledger fragments that survived, and the handful of family inquiry records that exist from relatives who, over the decades, tried to find out what happened to someone they knew had been committed to Greenbrier and never heard from again. 300 is, by the report's own careful, hedged language, a conservative estimate of individuals for whom no subsequent record of discharge, transfer, or documented death can be located. It may be higher. Given the scale of the documentary gaps the report itself identifies, it is entirely possible it is meaningfully higher. In 2006, a graduate research team from a different regional university, working independently of the 1994 project, conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey of the 4-acre section of the Greenbrier property known locally as the Field. The area the original 1955 state inventory had identified, without elaboration, as a burial ground. This survey, more technically rigorous than anything previously attempted at the site, identified 463 distinct subsurface anomalies consistent with individual grave shafts across a section of land that, based on the numbered metal stakes that partially survive across the field, appears to have been used for burials in a roughly sequential pattern from the hospital's earliest years through at least the mid-1960s. 463 graves. Cross-referenced against the surviving fragments of the burial ledger. Fragments, not the complete ledger, which, as previously noted, has never been recovered. Researchers were able to tentatively match approximately 110 of those graves to a specific name, using the numbered stakes and whatever partial documentation could be connected to those numbers. The remaining 353 graves, more than 3/4 of the total identified in the survey, correspond to no surviving documentation that connects a grave number to an individual identity. This detail matters enormously to how you should understand the rest of this story, because it offers a partial, sober counterpoint to the more dramatic 300 patients never left, framing that has circulated in less careful retellings of Greenbrier's history. A significant number, possibly the majority, of the people who were never accounted for, after Greenbrier's closure, did not vanish into some unexplained mystery. They died at the hospital, over its 37 years of operation, the way patients reasonably could be expected to die at any large institution housing a vulnerable population for decades, and they were buried without ceremony and largely without names that survived in the field on the northern edge of the property. That is a real tragedy. 353 unmarked, unidentified graves represents 353 human beings whose families, in many cases, likely never received confirmation of what happened to them, and who exist today only as a number on a rusted stake in an overgrown field. But it is a tragedy of institutional neglect and inadequate record-keeping, not necessarily of anything more sinister. What remains genuinely, documentably unresolved, what the burial survey does not explain, is the gap identified in Part 6. Harlan Beck's count of 41 beds in Ward D against the documented transfer of 34 residents. Those 7 individuals, if Beck's count was accurate, are not obviously explained by the burial field, because the field's last datable burials, based on the numbered stake sequence and what little correspondence survives, appear to predate the 1968 closure by at least 2 to 3 years, suggesting, though not proving, that nobody was actively being buried in the field during Greenbrier's final operational period, which raises the question of where those 7 individuals, if they existed, and if they died at or near the time of the hospital's closure, would have ended up. Greenbrier State Hospital, as a physical structure, is failing in the way that all abandoned institutional buildings in this climate eventually fail. The East Wing's roof collapse, which appears to have occurred sometime in the early 2000s based on vegetation growth patterns visible in the wreckage, has accelerated water damage throughout that section of the complex. Ward D, the building at the center of the discrepancy described in Part 6, remains the most structurally intact of the residential wards, oddly enough, possibly because its smaller size and more isolated position sheltered it somewhat from the worst of the weather exposure that has degraded the larger wards. It is still possible, as of recent years, to walk into Ward D and see the metal bed frames. Rusted now, some still bolted to the floor in rows, the way Harlan Beck would have seen them in September of 1968. The property has changed ownership twice since the state's surplus land division finally divested it in the late 1980s, passing first to a private investor who reportedly intended some kind of redevelopment that never materialized, and then to its current owner, whose identity is a matter of public record, but who has, by all local accounts, made no use of the property beyond minimal liability insurance and occasional inconsistent attempts to keep trespassers out. The field, the burial ground identified by the 2006 survey, remains unmarked by any official memorial or signage. A small group of local historical preservation advocates has, over the past decade, lobbied unsuccessfully for the state to fund a proper memorial and a more complete records search. As of this telling, no such effort has received funding. What remains, in the absence of any definitive resolution, is the story itself, passed down, the way stories like this are passed down across this region, through family members who remember a relative who went to Greenbrier and we never heard from her again, through the handful of surviving written accounts like Harlan Beck's, through the partial, conscientiously hedged academic reports that have tried and failed to fully reconstruct what happened, and through the local tellings that have, understandably, filled the documentary gaps with the kind of speculation that any sufficiently unresolved tragedy eventually accumulates. 300 people, by the most careful estimate anyone has managed to produce, went into Greenbrier State Hospital over the course of 37 years and never left it by any means that left a trace anyone has been able to find. Most of them, the evidence suggests, are in the field, the 463 unmarked graves on the ridge's northern edge, the majority of them belonging to names nobody alive today can attach to a stone. Some unknown remainder may be explained by the chaos of the 1968 closure, informal releases, lost paperwork, the ordinary failures of an overwhelmed bureaucracy trying to shut down an institution it had neglected for decades. And a small number, 7, if Harlan Beck's memory in 1979 was accurate, in a building that the state's own records insist was empty by the time anyone went looking, remain, 6 decades later, simply unaccounted for. In the most literal sense, the historical record allows. Not explained, not disproven, not resolved, just absent from every document anyone has ever been able to find. Among the partial documentation recovered in the 1994 University Archive effort is a small folder, easy to overlook among the boxes of administrative correspondence and inspection reports, containing something the report's authors labeled simply inquiry correspondence. Letters, 41 of them in total, sent over the decades by family members trying to find out what happened to a relative who had been committed to Greenbrier. The earliest dates from 1952. The most recent dates from 1991, more than 2 decades after the hospital's closure, written by a woman whose mother had apparently been committed to Greenbrier in the 1940s and who had spent years trying, without success, to locate any record of what became of her. These letters are, in their own quiet way, some of the most affecting documents to survive from Greenbrier's history, precisely because of how ordinary and how repetitive they are. A brother writing in 1958, asking the hospital administration for an update on his sister's condition, having received no response to 2 previous letters. A daughter writing in 1971, 3 years after the hospital's closure, having only just learned the facility no longer existed, asking the State Surplus Land Division, the only entity she could find any forwarding address for, whether they could tell her where her father had been transferred. A nephew writing in 1985, explaining that he was trying to settle his uncle's estate and needed a death certificate that, as far as he could determine, had never been filed anywhere he could locate. The surviving responses to these letters, where responses survive at all, are uniformly brief, bureaucratic, and unhelpful. Several simply state that records for the requested individual could not be located in the time available. One 1971 response to the daughter inquiring about her father states, in its entirety, that patient transfer records for this period are incomplete. Suggest contacting receiving facilities directly, followed by an address for the Eastern Receiving Facility that, based on a follow-up letter found in the same folder, the daughter did contact, and that responded 18 months later that they had no record of admitting anyone by her father's name. It is impossible to read this folder of correspondence without confronting the human scale of what the dry statistical language of 300 unaccounted for patients can obscure. Each of those 300 was someone's sister, father, a daughter, uncle, someone who, in a meaningful number of these documented cases, had a family member who spent years, sometimes decades, trying to get a straight answer about what had happened to them, and who, by every surviving record, never got one. One name recurs across more of Greenbrier's surviving documentation than perhaps any other single staff member, a man named Otis Pruitt, who worked at the hospital from 1949 until its closure in 1968, the longest documented tenure of any employee at the facility, and who, based on the partial staff correspondence that survives, appears to have worked primarily in Ward D during at least the final decade of his employment there. Pruitt is mentioned by name in Harlan Beck's 1979 account as one of the skeleton staff members still present in Ward D at the time of the September 1968 discovery, described by Beck as the only one of them who seemed to know what he was doing, like he'd just kept doing his rounds the whole time nobody was paying attention. Pruitt was, according to Beck's account, the person who provided the maintenance crew with what limited information they received about Ward D's remaining residents that day, including, notably, a verbal head count that Beck recalled as consistent with his own visual count of occupied beds, meaning that if Beck's memory of 41 is accurate, Pruitt's own count, given on the day of discovery rather than recalled 11 years later, may have corroborated it at the time, though no written record of Pruitt's count was ever filed. What happened to Otis Pruitt after Greenbrier's closure is, frustratingly, another one of the documentary gaps that defines this story. He does not appear in either receiving facility's staff hiring records for 1968 or 1969, suggesting he did not transfer with the patients into a new role at either institution, which would have been a common pattern for displaced state hospital staff during this kind of consolidation. A 1972 local newspaper article, unrelated to Greenbrier specifically but covering a county fair, includes a photograph caption identifying a man helping run a game booth as Otis Pruitt, formerly of Greenbrier Hospital. The last confirmed documentary sighting of him that any researcher has located. No death record for an Otis Pruitt matching his approximate age has been found in the county's surviving vital records for the subsequent 2 decades, though county record-keeping for this period, much like Greenbrier's own records, has well-documented gaps. Local oral history fills this particular gap, as it fills so many others in this story, with a detail that cannot be verified, but that has become a persistent thread in how Greenbrier is talked about locally. Several separate accounts, collected independently by local researchers over the years, describe an older man occasionally seen on or near the Greenbrier property, well into the 1980s, and, by a couple of the more recent accounts, even later, a man who never approached anyone who was usually seen near Ward D specifically, and who, in at least 3 separate tellings that researchers have compared, was described as appearing to be counting something, moving along what would have been the row of beds, his lips moving without sound. Whether this figure was Otis Pruitt, whether he was a trespasser unrelated to the hospital's history who simply became folded into its legend, or whether, the most mundane and most likely explanation, he was a composite invented across years of retelling from a handful of unrelated sightings of unhoused or wandering individuals near an isolated rural property, is impossible to determine from where we stand now. What can be said is only this: the detail of counting, without explanation, recurs across more independent strands of Greenbrier's folklore than almost any other single image, from Harlan Beck's bed count in 1968 to the murmured counting reported by visitors to Ward D in the decades since, to this unverified figure local accounts associate with Otis Pruitt. Whether that recurrence means anything beyond the way a community's collective memory tends to converge on a small number of haunting images over enough retellings is a question this account cannot answer, and should not pretend to. It's worth pausing before closing this account to be precise about what the surviving evidence actually supports. Separate from the speculation that 6 decades of an unresolved story will inevitably accumulate. What is documented through multiple independent and cross-referenced sources? Greenbrier State Hospital operated from 1931 to 1968 under conditions of severe, sustained understaffing and inadequate record-keeping, conditions that were identified and criticized by the state's own inspectors in writing on multiple occasions throughout the 1960s. The hospital's 1968 closure and patient transfer process was rushed, poorly documented, and resulted in a verifiable, multiply-corroborated discovery of an entire occupied ward that the state's own records indicated should have already been emptied. A subsequent, more careful transfer of that ward's residents was documented and logged. A discrepancy between an eyewitness bed count and the documented transfer number, 7 individuals, exists in the historical record, supported by Beck's account and the general corroboration of his co-workers, though not independently verified by any second physical count. A 2006 ground-penetrating survey identified 463 probable grave sites on the property, the large majority unmatched to any surviving identity record. 41 years of family correspondence demonstrate a pattern of relatives being unable to obtain clear answers about committed family members, both during and long after the hospital's operation. What is not documented and should not be presented as established fact, regardless of how often it's repeated in less careful retellings. There is no verified account of what specifically happened to the 7 individuals represented by the gap in Beck's count. There is no verified evidence of deliberate concealment, foul play, or intentional harm beyond the documented pattern of institutional neglect, understaffing, and inadequate record-keeping that defined the hospital's entire operational history. The figures and footsteps reported by visitors to the property in the decades since are oral history and local legend, the kind that accumulates around any sufficiently old, sufficiently abandoned, sufficiently tragic site, and should be understood and presented as exactly that, a real and significant part of how this place is remembered and felt by the people who live near it, but not evidence in the way the documentary record discussed in the earlier parts of this account is evidence. The honest summary of Greenbrier's story, the one that respects both the seriousness of what happened there and the limits of what can actually be proven, is this: a deeply flawed institution, operating with grossly inadequate resources and oversight for 37 years, almost certainly failed a significant number of the vulnerable people placed in its care, in ways ranging from simple bureaucratic neglect to outcomes that, 6 decades later, remain genuinely unresolved. 300 is the number repeated, because it is the most careful estimate anyone has produced of how many of those people left no further trace. Whatever the true number is, 300 or more, or, in some smaller portion of cases, fewer than the gaps suggest, once accounted for by paperwork simply lost, rather than people simply gone, the people behind that number deserve to be remembered as more than a statistic, and as more than a ghost story, even in an account that, like this one, has to tell their story largely through the silence the records left behind. The clock on Greenbrier's administrative building still reads 4:17. Nobody who has researched this place has ever determined with certainty whether that's the time it stopped during a power failure, a moment of mechanical failure, or simply the last time anyone cared enough to wind it. It has stayed that way for close to 70 years now, frozen above a building that, for 37 years, held more lives than anyone outside its walls ever fully accounted for. And that has spent every year since trying, and largely failing, to give those lives back their names. If you go looking for Greenbrier today, you'll find a gated, overgrown property at the end of a gravel road off a state route that most map applications still mislabel. A handful of buildings collapsing slowly back into the Kentucky hillside, and a field, beyond the tree line, where the only thing marking most of the graves is a stake with a number, and a silence that the people who've gone looking for answers there have for almost 60 years now never quite been able to fill.